It's been 6 years since Shamila Batohi was appointed to the top position of the National Prosecuting Authority. Can you really say that you've delivered?
I can say we've delivered, but we haven't over-delivered by any stretch of the imagination.
South Africans want to see the masterminds of state capture in orange overalls, but Batohi is running out of time. So is the country.
I'm not hiding away as a national director from very critical and honest assessments of where we are in dealing with state capture. I'm not hiding away from that.
But critics say the state capture failures represent a deeper crisis, and now her former deputy can no longer stay silent.
I don't think it's helpful to sugarcoat in the situation that we're in. You know, we really are in a crisis.
Publicly, Batohi said there was no crisis, but recordings of internal NPA meetings show her being more candid.
Guys, we can't try to make ourselves look good, but we're not. When the country is saying the national director is failing, I'm the one that gets put on a cartoon on a snail.
Sean Abrams, at one stage when he was national director, stood up and said, the days of disrespecting the NPA are over. And I'm afraid they weren't then and they are not now. The NPA is essentially being treated as a laughingstock.
The notion that the NPA is in some type of crisis and about to collapse is incorrect. The reality is that the NPA needs more skills, it needs more independence, it needs lots of things.
But does it also need new leadership? An amaBhungane investigation takes a frank look at the crisis in the NPA and its failure to prosecute those most responsible for state capture.
I am deeply frustrated, as are most South Africans, you know, who are desperate for real good news stories coming out of the NPA.
Hermione Cronje had left the NPA in 2012 when the writing was on the wall. She returned in 2019.
I was in the NPA since the beginning of the NPA, and the changes that the institutions had undergone in that period I was not prepared for. The institution was a shadow of its former self.
Cronje would head up the new investigating directorate, which would investigate and prosecute state capture crimes. Two powerful women, both determined to clean up the NPA. But the alliance wouldn't last. Within 3 years of working under Batohi, Cronje left the NPA for a second time. Her leaving was a sign for amaBhungane investigative journalist Sam Soul that all was not well.
For me, a big red flag was when Hermione Cronje resigned. And that's when they came out, when Shamila came out and said, there is no crisis, where in fact it was indicative of a real crisis.
For over a year, amaBhungane has tried to convince Cronje to tell the story of why she left and where she thinks the NPA is going wrong. We know you didn't want to be here. We've spent a year trying to get you to sit down with us. Why speak now?
The reason I decided to speak now is I've had enough distance. It's been 2.5 years, actually, since I left the NPA. It certainly wasn't an easy decision to leave.
I just want to play you something that Shamila said when you resigned.
The NPA is not in a crisis, and that there is no widespread sabotage of the ID or any part of the NPA that is taking place.
Fair? I mean, what was your reaction? What were you really feeling after that led you to resign?
My views were the direct opposite. I felt that the NPA was, and probably still is, in a crisis. I felt that there were certainly efforts to sabotage the work of the ID. And I guess it wasn't a view held by the leadership of the NPA which meant I was going to get very little support in trying to address what I thought were important issues.
When you say sabotage, sabotage by who? It's a powerful allegation to throw out there.
An example is my now former colleague, KNORX MOLELLE.
MOLELLE was a powerful figure in the NPA. As Special Director of the Asset Forfeiture Unit, it was his job to seize and preserve the ill-gotten gains of state capture. But in case after case, MOLELLE was accused of appointing curators to look after the assets, a job that required little work but cost the NPA millions in fees. News 24 legal journalist Karen Morn reported on the case where curators, appointed by MOLELLE, made millions off the ESTINA dairy farm.
They were essentially accused of seizing state property rather than GUPTA-owned property, and then claiming, money on that there was this huge alleged looting attached to a preservation of assets for an alleged looting.
In 2021, the NPA brought charges against MOLELLE, including gross misconduct, gross negligence, and dereliction of duties. The allegations are extremely serious and warrant your summary dismissal, the NPA told him.
Looking into those charges, they suggest sabotage, to my mind. And I think there were several other examples. It was going to be very hard for me to substantiate, because that required doing an investigation into the people I'm working with, who are supposed to be helping me investigate the perpetrators of state capture. And, to work in that kind of environment was really difficult.
MOLELLE has called the allegations hogwash and trumped up, and at the time invited the NPA to investigate him. But instead of throwing the book at MOLELLE, the NPA asked him to leave quietly.
Despite the very serious and possibly criminal nature of the allegations that Advocate MOLELLE faced, there was a sort of sweetheart settlement agreement that was reached, and he left the NPA without any real conclusive findings.
Why allow him to leave without any findings against him?
Sometimes there are some reasons why we take decisions that are in the best interests of the institution to move on. To make it sound like there was some shady deal is not correct. There was no golden handshake. We thought it's a reasonable amount. He was already being paid a salary for months and doing nothing in the organization, being suspended.
So was there an amount to bring this to a conclusion?
There was an amount, yeah, but it was no golden handshake.
For Cronje and others, the secret settlement was a sign of weak leadership. MOLELLE sees it differently and told amaBhungane it was merely a sign of how weak the allegations against him were. The settlement, he said, made clear that there were no findings against him. He went off into the sunset and reinvented himself. He's now the head of the Directorate on Corruption and Economic Offences in Lesotho. Considering that he now heads up the equivalent of IDAC in Lesotho, is that a decision you regret?
Not at all. It was in the benefit of the NPA to do it at the time, and we did.
But the fact that he left under a cloud has enabled him to go and secure a very senior post in Lesotho, where he's overseeing corruption matters. Doesn't that sting at all?
I don't know what motivated the Lesotho government to do that. There's nothing more I can say about that.
MOLELLE is not the only one in the NPA who never had to answer for their alleged malfeasance. Glynis Breitenbach was a senior prosecutor in the NPA, but was forced out during state capture. She warned Batohi that she needed to clean house.
All of those people who are problematic are still in that system, and they're causing problems. And at the time, I told her they're going to undermine you, and they are.
From quite early on, we heard rumours that Shamila Batohi was kind of hiding away in her office. We can take it no further than saying that those were rumours, but everything that's happened since then has kind of confirmed that perhaps like the president, she didn't have the guts for the job, didn't have the backbone for the job, because you had to take the organisation by the scruff of its neck, deal with the bad apples.
In December 2021, Cronje decided to walk. To stay at the NPA had become untenable for her.
my understanding is she wouldn't go with the spin over substance kind of program that they seem to have been on.
Her replacement, Andrea Johnson, was a seasoned prosecutor.
We have an incredible woman in Andrea Johnson who has the skills, capabilities, expertise that is needed to drive the ID to the next level. And that, in fact, they say sometimes, there's silver linings. And so, in my view, it was a good transition.
In a meeting with staff, Batohi laid out her plans. State capture cases were paramount.
The next year is going to be the defining moment year for the NPA. My focus as the National Director is going to be how do we deliver on Zondo? Our focus is Zondo Commission. It's about just getting matters enrolled, arrests. I won't speak to you now until maybe after 6 months we're going to be celebrating and popping lots of champagne.
Johnson was on a roll. Suddenly, there were multiple high-profile arrests. TRANSNET, ESKOM, a former cabinet minister. The arrests within 10 months earned Johnson the title of Person of the Year from Daily Maverick, and Batohi was in a celebratory mood.
Her first words were, the cancer of impunity is over. And the cancer of impunity is very much thriving in South Africa. And I think that there was an underestimation of the damage that was done to the NPA. I think she has admitted as much in subsequent interviews.
And as one state capture case after another faltered, amaBhungane felt compelled to ask the leadership the hard questions.
Look, amaBhungane is an accountability organisation as much as a media organisation. And it's my view that unless we fix the state accountability systems, we're going to become more like Mexico than we already are. So we're going to head for failed state status. And that's why we've got to fix the NPA.
NULANE was the first state capture case the NPA would take to court. Its credibility was at stake.
You can't lose that one. And that case is imminently winnable. There's no question about that.
NULANE was a 25 million rand feasibility study that would persuade the Free State government to release R500 million for the ESTINA dairy project, the scam that laid the foundation for the GUPTA family's state capture plans.
I need to be careful, but NULANE is a case I was particularly proud of.
Cronje's investigators uncovered how a scrap metal dealer in India had offered to invest R500 million in a rural dairy farm in the Free State, but only if a GUPTA-linked company, NULANE, was paid to do the feasibility study.
And then we were asking, but who is this NULANE? And discovered that it was owned by Iqbal Sharma. And I remember one night sort of Googling Iqbal Sharma and coming across this house that he owned with his wife being presented on top billing. And putting those two things together made me realize, well, it's the beginning. It has the cast of characters that has featured quite prominently in the Zondo Commission.
It was a deal rank with alleged corruption and should have been an easy win against one of the GUPTA's key frontmen.
It seemed like it should be easy to prove that this contract should never have been awarded in the first place, and then when it was awarded, the proceeds were laundered for the benefit of the GUPTAs. So that's the simple story of state capture. Generate work, have yourself appointed to deliver the work, or not deliver the work, but make sure you get paid, and then direct the money in a way that you benefit from it ultimately.
But Cronje had concerns about whether the NPA prosecutors were up for the job.
The bottom line is we didn't have the capacity, we didn't have the skills in-house. And I, as someone who would be accountable for the cases that went to court, didn't feel comfortable betting on the prosecutors that we had to deliver the work.
Hermione's right, I agree with her, that there's a lack of those skills. We have incredibly good prosecutors that can prosecute murders, rapes, robberies, housebreaking, racketeering charges in their sleep, so to speak, because they are very, very competent prosecutors. But this type of specialized skill we recognize was lacking, definitely. We've been working very, very hard to make sure that we plug these gaps with a whole range of initiatives.
In January 2023, the NULANE trial got underway. But over the 6 weeks set aside for the trial, the NPA began to unravel. News 24's Karen Maughan was in court.
There was such a profound lack of seriousness from some of those investigators that it was mortifying. And then, of course, it tried to show money laundering, but they had their financial investigation really wasn't on the level of being able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that money laundering had occurred. The basics required of any successful prosecution simply weren't done.
By then, Cronje had already left the NPA and could only watch from the sidelines.
Even though I wasn't in the NPA, I was still watching it closely, and how it ended is deeply frustrating and disappointing.
One of the most egregious examples was that they'd had a letter sent that was used to justify the NULANE contract. And the NPA hadn't even checked that the people whose names were on that letter had actually written it, that the letter itself was genuine.
The judge called it a comedy of errors and hammered the NPA for the lackadaisical manner in which the case was approached.
That criticism, I think, is devastating. Admitting documents into evidence, that's trial work 101. Right? And the fact that the judge thought we were hopeless at that is devastating. And I think that is something that the NPA needs to take to heart.
They had to throw every single resource they had at that case. There's no excuse for not having done it, none.
You, as the National Director of Public Prosecutions, should be getting feedback daily. There should be a bomb squad, on standby. There should be support for the witnesses, support for the prosecutor. If things are going south, then there needs to be intervention. There was none of that. It just dribbled to a completely lame failure.
In April 2023, the Bloemfontein High Court discharged all of the accused without requiring them to defend themselves. Why did you not intervene when you saw that the case was going off the rails?
What would you have wanted me to do?
You've got extensive powers under Section 22 of the NPA Act to intervene, to say, give me a report on what's going on with this case. Why not intervene, make sure that didn't...
How do you know I didn't?
Did you?
That would have been a good first question.
But did you intervene in that
Of course
case?
I did. There are lots of things that happen behind the scenes because we understand the reputational damage for an NPA when these cases fail.
Why were those interventions not successful?
I have no idea. Right? I cannot say because we did the best we could. So,
really? I mean, the judge spoke about a comedy of errors, lackadaisical manner in which evidence was
I thought
handled.
we dealt with this. Do you want to go back to that?
Sure, yeah, I'd like to. The NPA believes the judge got it wrong on NULANE and has asked the Supreme Court of Appeal to consider ordering a retrial.
How a judge decides a particular case, we can read a judgment and try to understand that, but that's as far as we can go. But why interventions fail? I mean, every intervention in the world doesn't always succeed.
With the collapse of the NULANE case, the NPA lost the opportunity to persuade a key GUPTA frontman, Iqbal Sharma, to turn state witness.
Someone who's in the room when the crime is being committed, flipping and giving evidence for the state. You only get that if accused persons have a realistic fear that when charged, they could be convicted and go to jail. In NULANE, I had a similar hope that, once we have a conviction, people will start realizing that they are coming for us and they will be successful.
The Supreme Court of Appeal still needs to decide if they will listen to the NPA's arguments for a retrial.
I think Acting Judge Nompumelelo Gusha was absolutely justified in describing it as a comedy of errors. I would be amazed if they succeeded in that application.
Colleagues, what is happening in ESKOM is almost an attack on our country, on the people of our country.
And until we hold those most responsible, they're going to hold our country to ransom. And nobody should be allowed to do that.
At the height of state capture, MATSHELA KOKO was one of ESKOM's most powerful executives. In a pre-dawn raid in October 2022, KOKO, his wife and his stepdaughter were arrested for an allegedly corrupt tender at the Kusile power station.
We've seen since then that it's easy to arrest people. It's not that easy to bring them to trial and to have a successful prosecution. And that is what counts. The point is you reduce confidence in the organization if you arrest people and then you can't follow through.
The NPA alleges that Swiss company ABB channeled kickbacks to KOKO and his family. ABB has since done a deal with the NPA to pay back 2.5 billion rand. It should be a really strong case, because what they have is they have one of the key executives from ABB who agrees to testify, to confess everything in exchange for immunity from prosecution. So the NPA have ABB handing over vast amounts of evidence to them about the corruption, alleged corruption that happens in the case. But when the family appeared in court, the NPA asked the magistrate for a postponement. In an interview with Daily Maverick, KOKO warned that the NPA better be ready.
The NPA is not entitled to arrest me and then take more than 10 months investigating when they've had the benefit of 6 years of investigation and a slam-dunk affidavit from ABB. If you think NULANE's matter was an embarrassment, then you have not seen much.
And the NPA was about to embarrass itself, just as KOKO predicted. When it asked the magistrate for another postponement, he refused and struck the case from the roll. Breitenbach was in Parliament when she heard the news.
As it happened when we struck the roll, we were sitting in a portfolio committee where they were present. The NPA was in fact present, and I practically lost it and demanded an explanation, which they couldn't give. There's just no other way to describe it. You screwed up NULANE. Now you've got KOKO et al. on the roll, and it gets struck off. I mean, struck off. How? How is the National Prosecuting Authority not ready with their cases?
As it turned out, the NPA had failed to secure the services of a data analyst to sift through the millions of documents seized in the process, causing the delay.
The issue of whether the NPA was ready when it arrested all the accused in that matter, that remains an open question, because the NPA's own admission is it wasn't ready. Why did it choose to arrest when it did, if it still needed this time to prepare?
That matter was, and I've explained this publicly many, many times, but clearly people either don't read, don't care, or don't listen. But I'll explain it again. This was a case where there was a large amount of digital forensic data that was seized subsequent to the arrests. So the analysis of this kind of digital data is one of the biggest challenges that we are facing in this country. But we are trying really hard to get that case back onto the roll.
Why did the NPA arrest if it wasn't ready?
We were ready at that point, but after the arrest, there was a seizure of a lot of this data that needed to be analyzed as well. It's petabytes of data.
Why were the seizures not done first before bringing the case to court?
That is a very good question. We've learned a lot of lessons from this, and that is, I agree with you. I've said to prosecutors, let's ensure that these searches and seizures are actually done earlier so that when we don't have the same problem.
The NPA asked the magistrate for a 4-month postponement to complete the investigation. He refused and told the NPA to re-enroll the case when it was ready. Matthew Sissoko is the head of investigations at IDAC, the new NPA unit dealing with state capture crimes. It's almost a year later, and that matter hasn't been re-enrolled, which suggests that the judge was right, that the NPA wasn't ready to proceed with that case.
We said to the judge, there is this data that needs to be analyzed. We need so much time to do that. Now the judge has removed the matter from the court. We don't have that kind of pressure.
Isn't that pressure sometimes self-imposed because the NPA is rushing out to make high-profile arrests and then investigating later? Is your view that that should not be the case?
I beg to differ with you.
Yeah.
I beg to differ with you. That is not the case.
I absolutely agree that the arrest now, investigate later pathology is very much alive and well in the NPA, to the point where the National Prosecuting Authority is often referred to as the National Postponement Authority.
Unless the NPA brings this 2.2 billion rand corruption case back to court, KOKO and his co-accused are off the hook. ESKOM and NULANE, two vital state capture cases, both failed in court within months of each other.
In summary is that the NPA can't deal with complexity. They can't deal with complex commercial crime cases, and they don't know how to sequence their battles, sequence their targets, and prioritize.
The NPA boasts about its many successes. It's enrolled 547 corruption cases and convicted 700 government officials, it says. But it just can't get a serious state capture conviction in the bag.
Colleagues, if we do not deliver in the next 6 months on state-owned entity cases, state capture cases relating to our SOEs, no matter what else we do, the country will see us as not having succeeded. That's the reality.
But now, after 2 years of disappointments, Batohi downplays the significance of the state capture cases, calling them 0.01% of the NPA's work. Those are your words. You knew this was the deal when you took the job. Why say now that you're being judged too harshly?
Even though it's such a small percentage of our work, we recognize the importance of it. And I think when people want to judge the NPA, another huge part of the work was rebuilding a broken, fractured, and traumatized NPA. And that is why I say that's the kind of drudgery of the back-end work. It's not sexy, it's not what sells newspapers, but it's a critical aspect of building our democracy.
To say now that it's 0.01% of your work feels quite convenient now that those cases are not going anywhere.
Doesn't mean it's still not our focus. In fact, when I came back from The Hague in 2019, I knew dealing with state capture matters will sadly be the defining thing for the NPA. And I say sadly, right, because it's an important aspect, but people will forget about the really other, the 99% of crime rebuilding that I talked about. I don't want to go through that again. But we recognize how important it is to focus on these particular cases.
But the record of state capture cases actually progressing to trial is dismal. The ESKOM TRANSNET SAP contracts, that one is still under investigation.
Yes.
The TRANSNET Neotel contracts, that one I assume is also still under investigation.
It's still under
investigation. The TRANSNET cutting edge contracts, the locomotive contracts, the relocation of the OEMs, SAA, Mumbai Lufthansa, Denel.
Still an investigation.
I mean, objectively, isn't the NPA in a worse position than it was 2 years ago?
Well, it depends from which vantage point you are looking at it, From where we are sitting, we are making quite a progress in these matters. These are complex matters, and you're dealing with the kind of accused who have all the resources to fight. It's not going to be easy.
In my view, an organisation paralysed by fear of failure. Nobody wants to be that guy who goes to court and loses. So everyone's kicking for touch. Everyone's investigating as much as they possibly can to keep them out of court. They don't want to go to court because they're afraid of failing. And in my view, that's the biggest problem.
TRANSNET is one of the NPA's most important state capture cases. Almost 3 years later, though, the trial hasn't even started.
The fact that we are arresting, but we're not even commencing trials, is what's deeply troubling. And if you're arresting and years later nothing's happened, the trial hasn't even commenced, you do run the risk of no one taking you seriously.
In May 2022, TRANSNET's high-profile former executives were arrested. You see Brian Molefe, you see Siyabonga Gama, you see Anaj Singh, you see Gary Peter, Patola Ramasabudi. These are the people who have had the keys to TRANSNET for the last 10 years. These are the CEOs, the CFOs. It's hard to imagine more senior people that you could put in the dock there. The charges include fraud, corruption, and money laundering. TRANSNET theft involved billions. Essentially, in 2012, TRANSNET found itself in a situation where it was going to have to start procuring new locomotives to replace its existing fleet, which was eventually going to retire. So they bring in the US consulting company, McKinsey. McKinsey's strategy was for TRANSNET to buy far more locomotives than they needed, ostensibly to drive up demand and get coal and freight back onto rail. And that does two important things. The first thing that it does is it unlocks a vast amount of consulting work. The second thing that it does is it unlocks an astronomical amount of procurement spend. TRANSNET would eventually buy 1,064 locomotives at a cost of 54 billion rand. It's on the scale of, the arms deal. It's a Medupi and Kusile. It's one of these contracts. It's the kind of government spend, it doesn't come around every year. It's a sort of, once in a decade pot of gold. Out of this pot of gold, the Guptas negotiated 9 billion rand in kickbacks. The consultants alone walked away with 2 billion rand. The NPA's response to a crime of this scale has been to throw all the accused in the dock. You only make that mistake once, says Breitenbach.
They keep on taking matters to court with 10 and 11 and 12 accused. It's madness. You can't win a case like that. You can't run a case like that. The first time they appear, one accused will have an ingrown toenail, must get postponed. Second time, someone's got a pimple on his nose, must get postponed. And when you've worked your way through the trail of accused, then the defense start being sick. So it just never comes to trial. It's madness. You need 1, 2, 3 accused tops. You deal with the other small fry on your way. You do 105As and trials and build your case until you're ready for the big oak.
Anton du Plessis is the Deputy National Director of Public Prosecutions in charge of strategy, operations and compliance. Has the NPA erred with that case by simply putting all of the accused in the dock and creating a case that is too big and too unwieldy to ever actually go to trial?
It is a hugely complicated matter. We have some of the top counsel in the country working on it. But what I do agree with you on, there could be a tendency, I'm not saying it is in this case, to throw the book at the accused, where sometimes you do need to take an Al Capone approach, as they call it, and rather go for charges that are easier to prove.
The TRANSNET arrests, like the ESKOM matter, looked impressive, but was the NPA ready for trial? This internal recording of Andrea Johnson suggests she was asking her team to act the part, even if the files were empty.
I asked that everybody go to court, because you are a team. But we asked that everyone be dressed to the nines, and they were dressed to the nines. And I asked that they carry those file boxes, that you carry with your files, and make sure the spines are all marked, even if there's nothing in the file.
Is that the NPA strategy? Fake it till you make it?
Whether it's accurately quoted or not, I don't know. Who your source is?
We can play you the video.
Okay.
I just hope they had something in the files. But they looked the formidable team. And sometimes, colleagues, that is half the battle. Is look the part, you end up being the part, you end up playing the part.
You've got a video, that's fine. So I assume it's accurate. It's not a strategy of the NPA to fake it until you make it. But we want to motivate staff. We want people to feel that their work has meaning, and we want people to be excited about what they do. How Andrea chooses to inspire her people, I don't know. Maybe she thought that's some way of inspiring them. I can't answer for her. But it's not an NPA strategy to fake it until we make it. Because if you look at the 99% of the work that we are doing, nobody's faking anything.
Johnson didn't want to comment on the recording, and Batohi was dismissive.
You sort of don't want to engage with something that's so ridiculous that you have to even answer it. Let's put it that way.
Well, sure, but just to be clear, are you okay with, on a major state capture case, the idea that potentially prosecutors are walking into court when the first arrests have been made with empty files?
I guarantee you they're not walking into court with empty files. I would not be okay with prosecutors walking into court with empty files.
The people that you're dealing with on the other side are not particularly impressed by the spectacle. Either the high-level crime bosses and political entrepreneurs or their lawyers. And you're not going to win cases that way.
It's time to go back to the drawing board and say, why would we try to fake it? What are we trying to make here? And see how we make it rather than fake it. That kind of illustrates that what we're doing is arresting, and then we'll think about the next step. We'll figure out what we do down the line.
The TRANSNET case has already been postponed several times and goes back to court in January 2025, almost 3 years after the initial arrests. But two of the accused, Brian Molefe and AmaBhungane, are taking no notice. They are now members of parliament, earning 1.3 million rand a year. You often say that impunity is no longer a given. When accused in state capture cases are sworn in as members of parliament, it tends to send the message that impunity is the order of the day.
When I say impunity is no longer a given, what I mean by that is that in the past, during the state capture years, people could act with complete impunity, knowing that they had the arsenal of the state protecting them. Now, they know the days of impunity are over, in the sense that cases are coming to court, the capacity and capability of the state is being strengthened. They know that it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when that knock on the door can come.
I mean, do you think that's really going to, put the fear of God into any criminals? I mean, surely winning cases, people being convicted, orange overalls, that's actually what's going to make people think twice.
I have no doubt that people that are implicated are not sleeping easy at night.
If we look at state capture, if we look at organized crime, the way to understand most of these very large, complex crimes is through money laundering, because you have to clean the money that you steal. And yet we don't seem to be able to focus on that. We don't seem to understand what money laundering is and how to prosecute it.
In 2023, we found ourselves in the company of some of the world's dodgiest countries, when the International Financial Action Task Force placed us on the grey list. Treasury has been working hard to get us off this list, but if the NPA can't successfully prosecute money laundering, we stay on it.
If we can't demonstrate that we can go after organised crime, that we can go after money laundering, that we can go after people laundering, that we can't close down those operations successfully and with integrity, we can forget it. We're not going to make it as a country.
The work I do around in other countries at the moment is very much focusing on money laundering and how to successfully prosecute money laundering.
But, says Cronje, the NPA doesn't have the specialist skills it needs for complex financial crimes.
There were so many money laundering crimes identified in the Zondo report. And so if you are only focused on addressing money laundering, you take those cases and not start at the top, but start with more routine ones and more elementary ones and get your convictions and build on that jurisprudence. But expecting that prosecutors are just going to wake up and start adding money laundering charges or even standalone money laundering charges, it's not going to happen without that kind of sustained intervention.
South Africa has a month left to show FATF that it's done enough to get us off the grey list.
South Africa has done quite well on money laundering, and that's been recognised by FATF. We're very confident that by June next year we'll be off the FATF grey list.
What FATF wants to see is a sustained increase in investigations and prosecutions of serious and complex money laundering. And because of this, the NPA has changed what they report to Parliament. Whereas they used to report convictions, now they only report cases enrolled.
There's far too much emphasis on we've got to look like we're winning this battle. I mean, it is important to look like we're winning the battle, but it has to be based on interventions that actually is going to ensure that we win the battle.
The ultimate money laundering case was the ESTINA dairy farm. Money comes in from the Free State Department of Agriculture, and instead of it being used to desperately prop up this farm that needs it, the money ends up being laundered out, laundered through Dubai, and ultimately comes back and ends up paying partially for the Gupta's fancy Sun City wedding. But to prove the case, the NPA needed the Gupta leaks, a hard drive of over 1 million emails from inside the Gupta empire.
It's a treasure trove. It wasn't a question of should we or shouldn't we apply to have the Gupta leaks admitted. It was a question of how do we do it. And certainly I don't see another state capture case proceeding without seriously introducing the Gupta leaks into evidence.
The NPA also needed bank statements from the Gupta's Dubai companies, but the UAE refused to hand them over. But how is that possible that 7 years after the Gupta leaks, we still don't have the formal bank statements from the UAE?
I think you get to a point where you accept that we are not going to get these documents.
What about access to the Gupta's UAE bank accounts, the bank statements that we need that are so critical for the ESTINA matter? Where are we with that? Because my understanding is we still haven't got those from the UAE.
If you had asked me where is the crisis within the criminal justice system, I'd say there is a crisis when it comes to international cooperation in criminal matters, particularly with certain countries. And unfortunately, my experience is that when law and politics collide, the law very seldom comes out the victor.
Even without the bank statements, the NPA still had the Gupta leaks. It took prosecutors 2 years to introduce them as evidence, only to have the judge throw the case out because they had taken too long to share the hard drive with the defense. The NPA says it's determined to have the ESTINA case reinstated. To date, that hasn't happened. In April 2016, City Press reported that 2 Gupta brothers, 5 assistants, and a mountain of luggage left Lanseria Airport in a private jet. Nearly 2 years later, AJ, the eldest, left on a commercial Emirates flight.
Well, the biggest failure was letting them go. We knew who the Guptas were, we knew what they had done, we knew what the implications were, we knew that we wanted to prosecute them, and yet they hopped on a plane and buggered off without anybody saying a word. There's been no consequences for that, which is beyond appalling.
The Guptas escaped to Dubai, and ever since, South Africa's been trying to get them extradited. Then, in 2022, 2 of the Gupta brothers were arrested there on an Interpol red notice. Cronje was sceptical.
I certainly felt that we were not being dealt with fairly and honestly by our counterparts in the UAE. I certainly felt that we were being played. The UAE were not genuine in their cooperation, even though they certainly did a lot of work to pretend that they were. But I could not have imagined that where it would end up is where we've ended up.
Unbeknown to the NPA, the Guptas had been quietly released. The UAE had simply ignored South Africa's request to bring them back.
Yeah, I found that extraordinary.
Then in May 2024, Ajay Gupta was arrested in India on an unrelated matter. The NPA had another chance to catch the state capture mastermind.
And were we ready? Did we have an indictment that featured Ajay Gupta? Did we immediately have a docket that we could send to the Indian authorities to say, hold this man for us, we want to extradite him? And we have a treaty with India? No, we are still trying to tread water, trying to keep our head above water, giving excuses about why we can't do that or haven't done that, or in fact not giving any excuses at all, just giving spin.
As we sit here now, I'm not terribly convinced that everybody wants them back as badly as we do. We all understand that there are a lot of people who have a lot to lose if they come back and sing like canaries, which they will do, make no error. They think they're going to jail by themselves, forget it.
Do you think that the NPA bears some responsibility for the fact that it's allowed the Guptas to escape not once but twice?
How did the NPA let them escape?
Well, the fact that the NPA didn't have a case ready the first time they left the country, when Ajay Gupta was arrested recently in India, that the NPA didn't have a case ready to say, hold him, we want him. Why do we not have a case against Ajay Gupta?
No, I don't want to comment on cases. You know Ajay Gupta was not part of the original Interpol Red Notice, so it's not the same.
Of course, but he is a key kingpin in state capture. There's more than enough evidence to show it. Why didn't we have a case ready?
Because there isn't enough evidence in that case to have brought an application for their extradition at that time.
But with both the NULANE and ESTINA cases struck from the roll, even if the Guptas were caught again, there is no case we can use to extradite them.
The extradition request for the Gupta brothers was for the NULANE case and it was for ESTINA. And both of those cases, for different reasons, are now essentially legally dead. So as soon as that case died a death, the attempt to extradite the Guptas going forward was substantially weakened.
By April 2024, the NPA told journalists that they had turned a corner and learnt their lessons. But the recent withdrawal of the case of former Cabinet Minister ZIZI KODWA raises doubts. KODWA was arrested in June 2024 on charges of corruption for an alleged 1.7 million rand bribe, some of which was used to buy a luxury car. Let's talk about, for instance, the ZIZI KODWA case. Mm-hmm. That high-profile arrest gets taken to court. 6 months later, the charges get withdrawn.
The National Director had nothing to do with that decision. We are reviewing that decision because it is a high-profile case.
The decision to withdraw the charges was taken by Andrew Chauke, who holds the powerful position of Director of Public Prosecutions in Gauteng. You, a year ago, asked the President to suspend Advocate Chauke. Isn't it your job, if the President doesn't act, to kick up a fuss, to say this is not okay?
Do you know whether I'm kicking up a fuss or not?
I don't know. Are you? Are you publicly calling out the President and saying...
It's not my job to kick up a fuss. It's my job to do what a National Director is required to do in this position, responsibly and ethically. And that is what I'm doing.
Chauke has denied any wrongdoing and submitted reasons why he believes there's no case to suspend him. The fact, though, that he took the decision to withdraw the charges, it potentially points to the fact that there are bad actors within the NPA who are undermining the system from within, doesn't it?
That's an assumption you're making.
The other option is that the NPA once again brought a case to court that was half-baked.
So I must now look at the evidence without making any assumptions about it and objectively decide whether the DPP's decision was correct or not. And that is what I'll do.
Are you concerned that a year has passed since you asked the President to suspend Advocate Chauke and that a decision has still not been taken?
Of course I am. It is unfair on the institution. It is unfair on the individual concerned. We need this matter to be put to bed, whatever it is.
When she first arrived, Batohi was bullish that the NPA would deliver on state capture cases.
not delivering on what we've committed to is a non-negotiable. We haven't made an unreasonable commitment because my philosophy generally is under promise, over deliver.
She was even willing to stake her job on it.
If we don't deliver in the next 6 months, I think I must reconsider my position as the NDPP, frankly, about whether we can deliver on this and whether maybe somebody else needs to come in and take this institution to another level, because the need to actually show the country that we are really serious and we're good at this.
But recently, an embattled Batohi has become defensive.
Allowing a narrative that the NPA is failing without critically analyzing the facts is not only flawed, but also dangerous.
So let's look at the facts. You've often spoken about the conviction rates in other types of crimes. How many state capture cases have actually gone to trial?
I think there are 2.
The NPA says it has a much longer list of cases where arrests have been made. But arresting people is a hollow type of justice if the cases don't go anywhere. Can you really say that you've delivered?
I can say we've delivered, but we haven't over-delivered by any stretch of the imagination. We've delivered, it depends how do you define delivery, okay?
Well, how would you define?
We've defined delivery in that we have enrolled 37 cases in the ID. We have an ex-Speaker of Parliament in court. We have an ex-President that's being prosecuted. We have the Secretary-General of a ruling party.
Sure, but you're saying delivery is getting a case enrolled. Now, a number of those cases that have been brought to court have been struck off the roll. We've got the NULANE case, the first major state capture case.
How many more?
We've got the ESTINA case, struck off the roll. We've got the KOKO case. We've got the charges being withdrawn on the EOH case. The TRANSNET case has been in court for 2.5 years. That still hasn't proceeded to trial.
So that's the way prosecution, that's the way these systems and processes work. NULANE is under appeal, right? KOKO will be re-enrolled, okay? ESTINA will be re-enrolled. In my view, these are not failings yet. They're setbacks. They are serious setbacks that we have properly interrogated and that we are learning from. But they're not failures.
Next year, Batohi and 2 of her deputies retire.
In my view, they haven't done enough. And where will we be then? Things need to happen, and we've got a year for it to happen.
Breitenbach is unconvinced and is pushing to create an independent anti-corruption commission answerable only to Parliament, which she believes will be more effective than the NPA.
This is my crusade. The criminal justice system needs to work in this country. Without it, we have nothing.
Do you think that you've been tough enough for this job?
I don't think what I think about myself is important. I think I leave the people of this country and for you all to make your very considered judgments on that and let the work speak for itself at the end of the day.
Right now, it's speaking volumes.
Every single time one of these much publicized failures happen, that cancer of impunity that Shamila Batohi said she hoped the NPA would be able to eradicate, that she said would be over, just grows and grows and grows.
amaBhungane, digging dung, fertilizing democracy.